Hey everyone, I'm Arya and you're watching Byte-Line. Today, we're tackling a huge topic, the Ukraine war. We're going to go beyond the headlines to tell the full story, the one you probably haven't heard. We're connecting the dots between 30 years of history, game-changing tech, and the global economic fallout. Let's get into it.
So here's the central question, right? How does a war that was supposed to be over in 3 days turn into a multi-year conflict that has completely reshaped our world? Well, the answer isn't just about tanks and trenches. It's hidden in decades of simmering tension, in lines of code from cyber attacks, and in the global flow of oil and grain. That's the story we're unpacking today.
All right, so to really get what happened in 2022, we can't start there. We have to rewind the clock, way back, about 30 years actually, to see how the fuse for this whole thing was first lit.
It all kicks off in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolves and boom, Ukraine is an independent nation. Now, just 3 years later, Ukraine makes a massive move. It gives up its entire nuclear arsenal, which was the third largest on the planet, in exchange for a security promise from Russia, the US, and the UK, called the Budapest Memorandum. Then, get this, in 1999, Russia itself signs a charter saying every country has the right to choose its own alliances. But the real breaking point comes in 2014. A pro-Russian president in Ukraine gets thrown out, and Russia's response is to annex Crimea and kick off a war in the Donbas region.
And this quote right here, it just nails the core of the problem. For decades, Russia has seen NATO getting bigger, not as a defensive move, but as a direct threat pushing right up against its borders. You could say this one single geopolitical fault line was just sitting there, building up pressure for 30 years, waiting to rupture.
And then that rupture happened. The full-scale invasion began, and while the entire world had its eyes glued to images of tanks rolling across the border, the real first shots of the war had actually already been fired, just not where anyone was looking.
Seriously, the opening salvo of this conflict had nothing to do with gunpowder or artillery shells.
They were fired in cyberspace. This was hybrid warfare from minute one. And here's the thing, this wasn't some new playbook. Russia had already pulled off successful cyber attacks against Ukraine's power grid back in 2015 and 2016, so the physical invasion was actually preceded by a digital one, trying to sow chaos and cripple the country before a single boot hit the ground.
And this is where we get to the tech turning points, which is what we live for here on Byte-Line. While everyone was watching those long columns of Russian armor on the news, the real direction of the war was being decided by a hidden technological battle, and it changed everything.
So what you had in those early days was a classic David versus Goliath scenario. On one side, you've got Russia's conventional army, just massive columns of tanks and heavy artillery. But on the other, you have Ukraine fighting asymmetrically. We're talking small, nimble teams with shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles. And, this is absolutely key, swarms of cheap, fast FPV drones. They basically turned Russia's greatest strength, all that armor, into its biggest vulnerability. It was a textbook case of smarter, more agile tech stopping a much larger force cold.
But you might be wondering, how do you pay for a high-tech defense like that? Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is this number, over $118 billion. That's the total aid committed by the United States.
And it wasn't just the US. Europe stepped up in a massive way too, with the EU and its members committing nearly 88 billion euros. This incredible amount of economic firepower really became the financial backbone of Ukraine's ability to fight back.
Okay, but a conflict this big never stays contained to the battlefield. It sent a massive shockwave through the entire global economy, and I guarantee you felt its impact, probably right in your own wallet.
Just look at this chart. See that massive spike? That's energy prices in Europe hitting the roof in late 2022. That single factor drove inflation to record highs and triggered a cost of living crisis that hit millions of people every single day at the gas pump and the grocery store.
Now, Europe's reaction to this was nothing short of a seismic shift. Before the war, the EU was getting over 40% of its gas from Russia. By 2023, look at that, it plummeted to just 10%. That is one of the fastest, most dramatic energy pivots in modern history, and it completely redrew the world's energy map.
But the economic war didn't end with energy. It's easy to forget, but Russia and Ukraine together supply over a third of the world's wheat and more than half of its sunflower oil. By blockading ports and hitting grain silos, Russia effectively weaponized food. It disrupted global supply chains and created a food security crisis for millions of people all around the world.
So let's fast forward to today. We're in August of 2025 now, and the war looks very different. It's evolved into a brutal, high-tech war of attrition.
And frankly, the tactics and the tech being used right now are giving us a terrifying preview of what the future of warfare is going to look like.
One of the game changers in this new phase is something called the UMPK glide bomb. It's like a Frankenstein's monster of a weapon. Russia is taking old, dumb Soviet-era bombs, literally strapping a cheap wing kit and a basic guidance system onto them, and suddenly they have a devastating weapon that their jets can launch from 90 kilometers away, far from danger. The impact these have had, both physically and psychologically, is just immense.
And this table, it really lays out the brutal math of this war of attrition. A recent report found some Ukrainian brigades are down to just 4 working artillery pieces. 4. They're facing overwhelming firepower and, in some key areas, nearly 30 separate attacks a day. For the soldiers on the ground, the #1 threat is those glide bombs we just talked about. For the Russians, it's the constant, nerve-shredding threat of those Ukrainian FPV drones.
And beyond the horrific human cost, the economic toll is it's staggering. The World Bank Group estimates that just rebuilding Ukraine is going to cost at least $486 billion. It's a number so big it's hard to even wrap your head around it. And it goes up every single day the fighting continues.
So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? I think it's that the lines have been completely erased. The distinction between military, technological, and economic warfare, it's gone. Modern conflict is total war. It's fought with soldiers and tanks, sure, but it's also fought with lines of code, barrels of oil, and the global supply chains we all depend on.
Which really leaves us with one final crucial question to think about. In a world that is this interconnected, this globalized, can a major conflict between nations ever really be just a local issue again? Or is every war now a world war in some way?
I genuinely want to know what you think about that. Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. And hey, if this is the kind of deep dive you're into, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Byte-Line. We've got a lot more explainers like this coming. Thanks for watching.